Welcome to this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic. Recently, we were given the honor of being invited into a discussion with a panel of experts in the aerospace industry hosted by the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, in the first of what we hope are many more similar talks to come. That premiere talk went a little long and the Q&A got cut short, so we reached out to the organizer to see if we could arrange one-on-one interviews with any of their experts, and we are very pleased to hear back from Jim Mazur, one of the most sought-after aerospace engineers of our time. He made himself available for a one-on-one, hour-long interview that turned into almost two by the time we were done, and we covered a lot of ground. Jim is currently listed as the president of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, a position he has held since 2016, and he was selected by Space News in 2011 as one of the top 10 people who made a difference in space. So maybe we'll start with the bullet points from your resume, Jim, and go from there.
I guess I have a fair amount of experience. I started out working for McDonnell Douglas. I thought I joined the Delta rocket program, and Reagan was president at the time, and I immediately got put on Star Wars, working 6 to 7 days a week. We built 3 rapid prototype satellites in 6 years. And so that's where I kind of got hooked on velocity. I did end up working Delta rockets and helped architect the evolution of Delta 2 through Delta 3 to Delta 4, became chief systems engineer of Delta 3. Boeing had bought McDonnell Douglas, went on to be chief systems engineer of Sea Launch, became president of Sea Launch. In that time frame, got to know a guy named Elon Musk who wanted to start a rocket company, and we started talking to each other, and eventually he made me the first president and chief operating officer of SpaceX, and then went on to become president of Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne, and that's where I really got heavily into human space flight. Eventually went to Pratt & Whitney, ended up running the F-135 jet engine program, and then eventually came back and ran the space business for Aerojet Rocketdyne. So I tell people I have trouble holding a job.
Well, it sounds like you get headhunted a lot is what it sounds like. That's always a good position to be in. Now, you're also a member of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. Could you give us like the mission statement of that organization and maybe their elevator pitch roadmap for how to expand humanity out into the stars?
They have a website, and as a member, as part of Aerojet Rocketdyne, of course, I stay tied in with them. Basically, their vision is to be a preeminent industry advocate for sustained human space exploration, science, and space technology leadership by the United States. And they have some guiding principles, but it's really about advocating for, I talk about consistency and constancy of purpose in deep space exploration. And what it's not doing is necessarily advocating for one approach over another. So it used to be the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, and they recently rebranded themselves as the Commercial Space Federation. They have been out in very strong ways lobbying for commercial solutions to everything. What I would argue they might disagree with, to the exclusion of everything else. And what CDSE is about is the focus on deep space exploration using all avenues and approaches available, is how I'd characterize it. So it's not really either or. And you talk about old space, new space, or commercial and traditional. What CDSE is out there trying to do is balance the conversation about there's multiple solutions, and the solution's an and solution, not an or solution, is how I'd characterize it. And whatever's the best. And eventually, as commercial becomes more and more successful, then certainly that would be the avenue to go. But I would certainly argue that it's nascent in low Earth orbit, and extending that model to the moon and Mars today is probably not appropriate.
So we were part of the panel audience from February 28th. And one of the things that you said that really kind of resonated with me was along the lines of we can't abandon proven technology in favor of projected technology is pretty much how you put it. Could you expand on that a bit?
I think the soundbite I have in that is, why are we developing technology to go to the moon when we already have technology to go to the moon? Has already been proven, obviously, instead of developing technology to stay on the moon. So there's a lot of time and energy going to developing new technology just to get and land on the moon. And that is taking a lot of time and money. And I would argue time and money away from staying on the moon. I think these technologies that are in development could eventually become the next technology to getting to the moon more efficiently. But I think as a nation, it's more important for us to just get there and figure out how to stay on there for longer periods of time with a little bit more focus. The other part of that discussion is technology development tends to be sporadic and unpredictable. A lot of technologies with enough time and money can be made to work, but the question is it worth the time and money for that versus the alternatives you have? And some just doesn't work out. And so I think the lessons that have been learned in the aerospace industry and certainly the space industry over time is doing a development project that relies specifically on significant technology development means it's going to be very hard to deliver that project on time and on cost. In fact, it's rarely delivered on time and on cost. And that's what eventually led to, the concept of TRL or technology readiness level. And the concept is from very immature technologies or at like 1 or 2 to very mature technologies at 9. If you're doing a development project, depending on the complexity of that project, you want to know what technology is going into that project and its technology readiness level. And typically anything below 6, people would not want to implement into an overall system that also requires development. I would say right now there's a number of technologies being developed that are below TRL 6 that are required to get to the moon. And I would argue that's not an appropriate direction if we want to get there in a certain time frame.
Yeah, Marcia, during that panel, I think it was her that mentioned that TRL, certain systems somewhere between 3 and 4, which is still breadboard testing, is how she referred to it. So it sounds like if you were in charge of a lunar landing program, you would have picked up where SP-287 left off. They had the roadmap from Apollo, and they had all the redundancy and all the testing procedures, and they laid it all out. And there's a wonderful roadmap. In your estimation, or in your view, why didn't we just pick up from there?
That's a good question. I will tell you, in my last job is basically the president of the space business of Aerojet Rocketdyne. I had SP-287 as mandatory reading for all my direct reports, and I'm sure they flowed that down to their people because I think, the key thing about, high tech activities is to build on what your predecessors have done as opposed to starting over and finding a new path. And why we haven't gone down that path, I think there's a number of different reasons. There's this huge push towards commercial can do everything. And the sort of concept that NASA has become irrelevant, which I think is extremely flawed thinking, other than NASA can provide money to the commercial companies. And I think that's really flawed thinking, but it's been a push to really don't do anything in traditional methods. And so the way Apollo was done was considered to be sort of this monolithic whole of government approach to getting to the moon that was considered to be very, for some reason, very inefficient and very expensive, which I think in comparison, we can see was actually quite efficient. And at the end of the day, in today's dollars, relatively cost competitive for what's a very hard mission. So I think there's just been a push to move more and more towards this commercial approach. And one of the things I observed, and we created a chart that obviously I don't have access to anymore, but it showed everything what NASA was doing. And to get to the moon and stay on the moon, you certainly have to have the launch vehicle to get there. You have to have a lander that can go to and from the moon. You have to have the capsule. You have to have spacesuits. You have to have power. You have to have communications. And NASA's pursuing all of those. And in most of those aspects, with sort of commercial firm fixed price contracts, but also with multiple contractors. So for any one of these aspects, they may be under contract with, 2 to 4 contractors in each of those various different elements. And the contrast I would use to compare it to Apollo was extremely focused, mission focused, with one architecture ultimately and one approach and one series of tests to get there. And when I look at our approach to the moon today, I would call it very diffuse. There's many different architectures being pursued simultaneously with many different contractors. And so the concept is well, this is competition, this will merge, this will be the most cost effective. But I would say if we look at our progress to date, it's not clear that that approach is superior.
Well, no, we have Starship that had the first and solo option A before that was readdressed after the explosion of IFT-1. So what you've got with that program, from what we can see, is a complete abandonment of all other processes, supply chains, materials testing, all of it. Like just completely throw out everything that we learned in Apollo, everything that we learned in Shuttle, and decided to take their own route. And then with that, submitted the lowest bid, for which they've already burned through most of their money. They burned through, I think it's 2.6 billion of their 2.9 billion total fixed firm. So I asked the question during that panel, what happens when SpaceX runs out of money? And can you share with us the answer that you gave?
Yeah. So my answer is my assumption is that SpaceX has access to unlimited funds because that's been the case to date. So you just have to assume that that's going to continue into the future. I think NASA and its nations should be considering the possibility of running out of funds, whether they'd have to make up for if that option becomes more challenging. But my assumption is that they're going to continue to get the funds they need to continue through this activity. But what the variable then becomes is time. And so as we look what's been going on relative to what was signed up for contractually, this is taking way more time. And in fact, the latest series, there's been 8 test flights now. And if you look at the progress that's going on, it's clear that the time is definitely extending. They don't usually tell you the true projected time as you look at a progress today and it gets leaked out incrementally and we're starting to see this incremental slip, typically a year at a time of what's really going on with the program. And I think one of the most challenging things with where we're headed right now for the baseline system is all of this test activity to me appears to have nothing to do with landing on the moon. And so we're supposed to be working on a lander to get to the moon. Ideally the goal was 24. The backup plan was going to be 27. It's looking like 29. And I think, given what's going on, that's likely to slip out. And then the question is okay, how much time is this going to take? And does this nation have the luxury of that time?
So when you were at SpaceX, you're involved with the Falcon 1 or Falcon 9 program? Falcon 9, right? Because you had something to do with them landing commercial cargo.
Yeah, it was both Falcon 1 and Falcon 9, but I spent a fair amount of my time there on Falcon 1 after the first mission failure. And I worked fairly hard with the team and DARPA on the failure investigation. And we got to root cause relatively quickly, and it was relatively simple. And then Falcon 9, what I was really focused on with Falcon 9 is I went around and talked to the various organizations. At the time, Elon was not a fan of schedules nor systems engineering and integration. And I understood that to some degree because in the larger companies, both of those activities become extremely bureaucratic and extremely cumbersome, is how I'd characterize it. To get into excruciating levels of requirements and flow downs. And, the saying was, you're ready to go to the moon when the paper's higher than it is from here to the moon, basically. And so that general perception, I definitely could understand. But my experience told me the core of those two activities were certainly value added, but you had to keep them from becoming bureaucratic. And so the concept I came in with was sort of this concept of bringing a little bit more of, at the time I called professional management, sort of getting out of the garage and into a more professionally managed approach, which required some schedules and some system engineering and integration activity without the bureaucracy, maintaining your innovative spirit and approach and velocity, but getting a little more discipline into doing the job, which is really required when you're in the space business. And so as I was working on Falcon 9, I put together some high-level schedules that were very disconnected from what everybody was saying and certainly what was being promised. And that created a source of friction, is how I'd characterize it. But it did highlight the areas where we could see documenting what people are doing and how they flow together in what was called a tier one schedule, that we weren't working as efficiently as possible and came up with some ideas to work better. But in that time frame, it became clear to me that my approach to these development activities was different than the path Elon wanted to take. And at that time, Pratt& Whitney had bought Rocketdyne from Boeing and had offered me a job running that business. And so that was a great opportunity. I hadn't done much in human space flight, and Pratt& Whitney Rocketdyne and Heritage Rocketdyne had a ton of experience in human space flight all the way back to Apollo. And that was really intriguing. So I went and took that opportunity.
Yeah, that sounds like a good move. The development program's interesting because we've had, on top of just the hops for Starship, so 8, 9, 10, 11, and they all either caught fire and or blew up, and then 8 IFTs. The explosions of Starship are excused by the followers of Musk as being iterative development. Could you explain the difference between the development of Falcon 9 and Starship and whether or not you would consider the development of Falcon 9 iterative?
Well, as I said, I was involved very early in Falcon 9, so my only observations of Falcon 9 were from the outside. But the iterative approach is basically around a concept, rapid iteration, rapid testing, rapid failure, and rapid learning. And I've always felt time is money, and the fastest approach is usually the most cost-effective approach. And so the faster you can go, one, just the benefit of time to get to market and that sort of thing. And two, I truly believe at the end of the day, it costs less. And in many cases, you can, particularly in the engines, be able to change things out and iterate on the engine design relatively quickly, get it into test, and get real empirical data to learn from and make fast adjustments, rather than using a lot of excruciating analytical tools that are really approximations of reality and then getting in and finding a failure later. So this sort of iterative approach, rapidly iterating a design, rapidly testing, rapidly getting results and making adjustments, I think is appropriate in many cases at the right scale. In the old days, we used to have a process, it's called test, fail, fix. But over time, our experience, first of all, in getting to space and flying in space and our tools became much more advanced and much more sophisticated and a much better representation of reality. So there's this sort of dichotomy of how much do I test, fail, fix, and how much can I actually analyze in and minimize the failures I have and get close to the final solution in initial development testing. So there's different philosophies and approach, and I think there's sort of a Goldilocks spot there between testing, failing, learning, and making adjustments, and doing a lot of excruciating analysis and still failing. And on the other hand, having a lot of really big failures that cost a lot of money and ultimately time. So I think the answer is somewhere in between, and I think certainly what's going on in the industry today, we're seeing all ends of that spectrum.
I suspect that if the first 8 Falcon 9s had RUD'd during that program, that there would have been a halt to the program or the program would possibly have been canceled. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know. This comes back to typical businesses. I've been Delta 3 failed in its first launch, and I was put in charge of the failure investigation. And its existence was at stake, and it had a failure on its second launch in the upper stage engine, and that pretty much doomed Delta 3 with a shift to Delta 4. C launch, when I was chief systems engineer there, it failed on its third flight, and it was clear to us that not only did we have to have a good failure investigation, we had to convince all the insurance community, both international and domestic, that they felt we understood the problem. They were willing to insure the next launch. And if we couldn't do that, we would be out of business. So well, in businesses that have a profit motive, and a lot of businesses have to have a profit motive, the room for failure is relatively small, and the patience for failure is relatively short. When you have unlimited access to funds, then you have the option for failure because your business case doesn't necessarily depend upon it. So I think that's where it comes back to. I think in a traditional profitable business, a number of failures in a row can doom that particular activity. Either it'll get internally canceled by the business because the business case isn't closing, or your customers will walk away from you or even terminate it, depending on the types of contract you have. When you're self-funding, the tolerance for failure is obviously much, much greater.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened with Deer Moon, right? Where the schedule just kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So the client said, you know what, I'm done waiting. So that bit of conversation opens up a bunch of different avenues that we can go down. But first, you mentioned Sea Launch. And as the former president of Sea Launch, what was your take on the TED Talk where Gwen Shotwell was talking about setting up redesigned oil rigs off the coast of every major city and delivering people by rocket 100 at a time in 45 minutes or less?
I mean, Gwen, come on. This is awesome, but it's crazy, right? Like, this is never going to actually happen.
Oh, no, it's definitely going to happen. This is definitely going to happen.
How? Like, what?
Yeah, well, I can't speak to the timing, but the concept of sort of fixed launch platforms off the coast, I think does make a fair amount of sense in terms of being able to sort of rapidly create infrastructure and deploy it to where you need to. I think there's quite a bit to be said for that model. And in fact, with Sea Launch was probably the largest. Well, I mean, if they're going to do Starship, it'd be a much larger scale. But up to this point in time, Sea Launch has been one of the largest scale platforms of its kind, launching a very large rocket. And it was a mobile launch platform. So we had home port in Long Beach, California, and we had the launch platform and we had the command ship. But for every launch, we had to integrate the rocket with a satellite at home port and then travel to a fixed launch site, which was on the equator, almost directly south of the main island of Hawaii, launch from there and then come back. So the logistics of going to a launch site and coming back created, a limitation in just the number of launches you could do per year. And in my mind, created a number of inefficiencies. So we actually did study quite heavily the concept of permanently mooring the platform off the coast from somewhere near the equator. And that started to make a lot of sense so that, the platform was purpose built. You could make multiple of these and put them around the world, but being not too far from a coast helps quite a bit logistically, is how I'd characterize it.
But you wouldn't recommend that as a replacement to commercial air flight then?
No, and that's one of the things I was thinking about too, is just trying to figure out, perspectives on the space business. I think space is so different from anything anyone has a feel for. It's fairly arcane. The physics are actually quite complex. And then we have all these science fiction movies too, where, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, right? This concept of hopping into, an X-Wing fighter and jumping in, taking off, going out of the atmosphere, and all of a sudden going, it's beyond the speed of light is really, really fascinating, but no one has a clue how to do anything even close to that. But people see this kind of science fiction, and the best analogy people can make to space flight is the aircraft industry. But the airline industry and aircraft industry is very, very different from a physics standpoint. From a safety standpoint, also very challenging. And then the thing that the people want to naturally extend is an economic standpoint. And so, the whole concept with the airline industry is taking people and products to places where they are heavily desired, ultimately faster and at an affordable cost. And when you think about space, where are we taking people and products and what are they going to do there? And what are the economics of that? And so this is one of the things where right now there's sort of this fledgling commercial space environment in low Earth orbit, which is only 250 miles above the Earth. To date, there's been a couple of independent sort of commercial flights, but for the most part, NASA is the customer and NASA is the destination with ISS. And so this concept of saying, well, now we've conquered low Earth orbit and that's a thriving commercial space economy is definitely not true. But now extending that to the moon, which is 250,000 miles away, where for sure NASA is the only customer, and for sure NASA's creating the only infrastructure is, to me, a major leap to extending the commercial model to the moon when it really hasn't even been proven out in low Earth orbit.
Going back to one of the other threads from a couple statements ago, you're talking about the commercial aspect, and the commercial aspect has to involve a profit if companies are going to take this on commercially. And of course, to make a profit, you're trying to do things as cheap as possible, which quite often leads to cutting corners and whatnot. So the question I've got about commercial is, would NASA not be better off using the commercial providers cooperatively rather than competitively?
Getting back to the commercial model in general, it not only requires profit, it requires a market and demand, is
Yep.
how I characterize it, and it requires a cost-effective solution. There may be a demand and a market for something, but it may be so expensive that nobody's going to buy it anyhow until it somehow becomes affordable.
Or mandatory.
Right. I mean, that's just for, true commercial business. I think we use the term commercial as a proxy for a contracting method as opposed to, a true commercial environment. I think in some instances, competition makes sense. And I think that'd be in the area where the technology is more mature and perhaps it's an adaptation of a different application to potentially what's of use to NASA. That makes a lot of sense. But where NASA is basically funding the technology development, and when they do it under commercial contracting means, maybe the faster and cheaper way is to just get focused. And I think there's a mix, and I think you have to make the case every time on that. I personally believe if we want to get to the moon, it's got to be a national endeavor. I think there's benefits for international cooperation getting there, and it should be better thought out of what should NASA own and operate and what should they compete. And I think the pendulum's gone too far to one side of buying everything commercial. The other thing we have to consider when you do that is as NASA funds technology development through commercial contracts, and these commercial companies tend to co-fund some of that development. Who owns the IP? Taxpayer dollars are going to create technology, and part of the intent behind NACA, which was a precursor to NASA, and NASA is to help fund technology development for the benefit of the whole industry that could be shared with the whole industry. And are we moving away from that model? And is that a good thing for this nation to do so? And I think that's got to be a consideration as we look at how these contracts are being let.
Yeah, you've actually addressed a point that I was going to ask. When NASA's paying SpaceX billions of dollars and millions more for proving like just in orbit propellant refilling, they're being paid to develop something. Why, at the end of the day, does that product belong to SpaceX and not NASA?
Right. And I think that's a question that should be asked. And I think, having been in private industry where I've co-funded things, I would argue that I own the IP that I co-funded. And and the IP that I co-funded is really the discriminator relative to competition. So there'd be a ways to try and pick what technology you're going to fund yourself to try and get a competitive advantage. But I think that entire model should be questioned because, one of the concepts behind the US government funding this is to benefit industries as a whole, as opposed to single individual companies. The other phenomenon we've seen come out of this is with this private funding, with these quote commercial contracts, as these organizations learn things or have major technical issues, they're not being shared across the industry. And a big part of the success of the space industry has been sharing technical issues for the industry so that any issues that come up, the whole industry can take the lessons learned from that and apply them. Or in many cases, there would be specifications that would incorporate new requirements to take those lessons learned into the specification in terms of certain materials that weren't allowed to be used in certain applications. You shall not, basically, you shall not use this material in conjunction, or you can only use these materials in conjunction with these propellants, that sort of thing. And it will be promulgated through the entire industry, and the industry as a whole, the raising tide would raise all the boats in the industry. Now, as people have proprietary issues, only that company gets to learn from the issues. When I grew up in the industry and as I became a leader in the industry, I would tell everyone mistakes are okay as long as we learn from our mistakes. But it's even better to learn from other people's mistakes. and
That
and
costs
so
you nothing.
constantly be surveying the industry. And there's not as much of that going on right now because people's mistakes are proprietary.
Right now, we do have two competitors in HLS. We've got Starship, which is flying, I call them test articles. I don't even call them prototypes because they're not mission capable and they don't even resemble HLS. They don't resemble a tanker. They don't resemble a fuel depot. They're just hollowed out shells, really. And even the shells are having trouble getting to orbit. And then we've got Blue Origin, who got into the gate late because of what happened with the budget constraints and the dealings that SpaceX made with Kathy Lutters to get that solo option A. But they look like they're on pace to leapfrog Starship with Blue Moon. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. We've got 4 minutes left in this session.
Yeah, my comment is obviously the Blue Moon looks like a more traditional lander, and I think it is building on prior experience. So I think from a technology standpoint, I think there's still a lot of technology to mature on that particular lander too, but it's not as nearly as large of a leap as Starship is. That lander is single stage, which I think will be challenging to get to the moon versus two stages, and there's a whole conversation around that. And there's a lot of hydrogen involved and hydrogen transfer. So you got this cryofluid management activity. Hydrogen's at minus 423, takes more energy to keep cool than methane does. I know they're working on what they call zero boil off through solar power. And they've also got sort of a transporter vehicle that Lockheed Martin's working on that will have propellant transfer too. So there certainly are non-trivial challenges with their concept too, but those appear to be solvable faster than the challenges that Starship has, is my perception.
We had a question in the queue during that panel about burying liftoff engines into the regolith, two-stage versus single-stage, and I wanted your opinion on that. So I gather you are not a fan of single-stage landers, even though the requirement of Artemis is for everything that lands has to take off again.
Not to start out with, once again, we can evolve to these more sophisticated things, but why make a leap to the most sophisticated thing right at the beginning? In my view, you could have a lander that's hydrogen, which would be relatively efficient, but then have an upper stage and ascent vehicle that's storable, much more reliable. You move the propellants together, they ignite, and you can still have a much higher safety and reliability of getting off the lunar surface back into lunar orbit. That's where I would start with. If you really want to go with hydrogen, I think hydrogen's definitely an option for landing on the moon, but I would really want to see storables for getting off the moon.
Hydrogen seems to be the better option over methane if you're going to do in situ, because you just need electricity and a vessel to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. But for methane, you need Sabatier process and giant vessels to hold the base ingredients while you're turning it into methane. We're at less than a minute. I'm going to close this session off. And if you're good to go, then I'd love to pick this back up in a part two.
Sure.
All right, perfect. That's going to wrap up this segment of our conversation with Jim Mazur. And obviously, we covered a lot of ground here. So in part two, now that we're a little more familiar with each other, we're going to get more into the meat of the discussion and even start talking about some alternative approaches that might be considered if the USA is actually serious about getting humans to the moon before China plans to in 2030. Welcome back for part two of our discussion with aerospace expert Jim Mazur, who was gracious enough to give us twice as much of his time since our conversation was going pretty strong. We're actually going to pick up with a candid moment that got recorded in between timed out Zoom calls as everything was getting set up to record for part two. When I recorded the panel, I don't know, did you see the episode that we put together about that?
Yes, I did.
That was a lot of fun to be involved with. I'm very honored to have been invited into that. But the sync between the video and the audio was off by 10 seconds by the time, because I had to record them independently, which is why I'm doing this through Zoom. So I literally had to go and make the lips match the sound. of
That's
every one of those.
that's impressive. And I watched your billionaire space race, all 2 hours, and that's an impressive body of work that you put together there. I mean, I
Appreciate it.
was tracking it closely, and I still learned from that I wish I'd have known back in the day.
Now let's rejoin the conversation with Jim Mazur, starting off on the topic of the 3 lunar landers that NASA originally selected for testing trials, as discussed in our series The Billionaire Space Race. Honestly, if I was in charge of the HLS program, like Kathy Luiter's was, Starship would have been the last thing I would have considered. If there's 2 out of the 3, I'm going with Blue Moon and I'm going with the Alpaca, the Dynetics one. Those are traditional landers. They're short, they're squat. You don't have to ride up a 10-story cable crane to get into your airlock. Nothing about Starship makes sense to us, actually, for a lander. Barely for LEO, because once it's operational for LEO, it's not even as efficient as Falcon Heavy for tons. The readdressed limit on Starship is something around 60 tons. And of course, that's just a number pulled out of air, just like the 100 was to begin with. But we found it funny because as a lander, if you have to do 20 propellant fills on Starship, then Starship HLS compared to Apollo falls short on a tons to the lunar surface per launch. Apollo is actually more efficient per launch to get tons to the moon.
Per launch, that's correct. The concept, and by the way, yeah, that award was, I think, it surprised everybody because there was sort of this phase one where all 3 Dynetics, SpaceX, and Blue Origin had sort of study contracts, right, to compete for what they thought was going to be a down selected 2. And out of those 3, the SpaceX had the smallest amount of funding. And so it felt like there was some token funding going on there, and that it really, with that concept, objectively wasn't really in the running to win the whole thing. So it was, I think, a surprise, certainly to me and to many people when that happened. The concept of cost per launch, I think the angle here with Starship is basically, near as I can tell, 100% reusability. So the idea is it's the only thing it's costing you is the fuel. And so you've got this completely 100% reusable system that, in theory, can take a tremendous amount of payload to translunar injection because you're launching it from space with a very, very large fueled spacecraft. So I think that's kind of the mystique and angle behind it, is it's a fully reusable system where you're maximizing your payload capability to the moon by launching to the moon from space. That's the concept. Translating that into reality, it's funny because I was thinking about another concept that people actually worked on in the late 50s and early 60s pretty heavily. It was called Project Orion. And the idea behind Project Orion was, and it was Freeman Dyson was one of the physicists behind it, another guy named Taylor. The concept behind it was a nuclear pulse spacecraft. The spacecraft would have this giant pusher plate behind it, and you could set off a series of nuclear bombs that would push against the pusher plate. And as you set them off in a series, you could approach very, very high velocities, approaching potentially even the speed of light. And they actually were doing some work on that. And then, some non-proliferation things and some common sense, I think, came into play and it died. But conceptually, you can stand back and say, you can come up with an argument that says the physics makes sense. But the translation of physics and theory to engineering and architectural reality is where some of this stuff doesn't hang together too well.
Some of the roadmaps don't make any sense taking a look at them. So let's just compare the Blue Origin to Starship. The idea of the landers is that they're going to hook up with Gateway and they're going to be an elevator up and down from the lunar surface. It's actually Orion that's taking humans from Earth to the moon. Now, with the Blue Moon, with the Blue Origin paradigm, Orion is attached to a vehicle that's carrying a fresh tank of gas, basically for the lunar lander for Blue Moon Mark II, right? If Starship is attached to Gateway, where's their next tank of gas coming from?
As we studied the concepts, and I thought they would have clarified that by now, but apparently they haven't. In Mark II, that there is going to be this translunar transport with kind of a tanker that's going to come and fill it up again so it can go down and come back. And so the assumption we were making was there'd either be something similar like that for the Starship human landing system that would refill it in lunar orbit, or I don't think it would have enough fuel, but the concept of, or maybe it out of the NRHO could take a low energy path back to low Earth orbit and get refueled in low Earth orbit.
And then we're still talking 20 launches, 20 more launches of propellant, more than likely a loss of a couple of ships. If you've got a 5% chance of failure, you only have to launch 20 ships before you get one explosion statistically. I mean, Musk is heralded as being the genius that came up with, the best part is no part. I mean, he certainly didn't come up with it, but he's milking it for all it's worth. But then you have these systems that have 6 times as many engines and 20 times as many refilling flights. And refilling in orbit is unproven. They don't know that they can do that. If you go through our back library at all, we kind of deal with a lot of this stuff. And what they had was they had the two ships tail to tail at the time that we did that episode. And they were talking about either changing the velocity to slosh it one way or the other, or flipping it around to get gravity doing it. And that wasn't going to work either. Now they're on top of each other, kind of in a mated situation. And I don't see that working particularly well. What technology do they need to come up with that's going to push, because you can't pull in the vacuum? So you're going to have to push all the propellant from one vehicle to the other, unless I'm completely misunderstanding it.
Right. I don't know either. That's the thing. The first challenge, I mean, you've listed a lot of them, but the two big challenges that are facing really both companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin, SpaceX is infinitely more complicated, is keeping the cryogenics cold. And that is technology that I can't tell you what the TRL level is. I know that both Blue Origin and SpaceX are investing heavy in it, but that does take energy too. And so keeping cryogenics cold for very extended periods of times is a challenge. The second is the fluid transfer. And one of the non-trivial aspects of that is just simply the coupling mechanism between the two vehicles. That in and of itself is to how you couple. Can you keep it leak free? If it does leak, what does that mean? And then the actual fluid transfer, and then the massive amount of fluid that has to be transferred. All of those things have to be developed actually with both concepts. And I think that's really challenging. And I think in the earlier episode, you mentioned in-situ activity. And so there's some argument for picking, hydrogen or methane because of in-situ, either on the moon or on Mars. But in-situ is really, really, really far off, if ever. We know there's water on the moon, but you don't know really the condition it's in necessarily. I'm sure there aren't large frozen lakes in there that all you have to do is melt and convert into hydrogen and oxygen. I think the general thinking is that it's probably ice crystals trapped within the regolith. And so just extracting that into a usable form and then changing it into hydrogen and oxygen, that is non-trivial across
I
the
like it.
board.
Exactly. How do you get that mass of regolith into a sealed container and then heat it enough to not only melt but evaporate the water into something that you can separate? A lot of it, like I said, it doesn't make sense to us. The in situ episodes that we put together, we got really bored and decided that we're going to do all the math on this and what volumes of gases and what volumes of containers are going to be required. And then given the fact that Mars is so far away and it's 40% less solar energy actually hitting the surface, what size solar field of panels is going to be required just to get one Starship refilled to the point where it can actually come back to Earth as promised? And it was the better size of a football field, plus battery storage, because you're dealing with night and day on Mars, just like you are on Earth. You would have to have 100 starships or 1,000 starships carrying gear and landing relatively close to each other, which is something I don't think they can actually do with pinpoint accuracy on Mars. Like you can get a general zone for landing, but if you want to put a starship down next to another starship where people in EVA suits can actually walk between the two of them, I don't think they're anywhere near that.
Yeah, I mean, and so some of the comments I'd make is the idea is extend our experience in space from low Earth orbit to the moon, 250,000 miles away, and figure out how to live on the moon relatively close to the Earth and perfect things that then some could extend to Mars, not everything, but some of those could extend to Mars. As you do that, though, in my mind, is getting back to what technologies do you need to stay on the moon and pick the best technologies for getting to the moon that I would argue the safest, most reliable, and have the highest technology readiness level, which ideally is around 9. Picking, for instance, a fuel and an architecture to land on the moon, because someday you think you might be able to use water on the moon to create fuel and oxygen while you're on there, is a bad choice because that's so far off. You should pick what you think is optimum for the mission over the next few decades and evolve it over time instead of creating the penultimate. So I think there should be some questions around that. And then Mars, of course, its distance from the Earth varies drastically, on average around 140 million miles. But the challenge with Mars, and I don't think people really comprehend this, is there's two kinds of general extremes of emissions: conjunction class and opposition class. And what those mean is the relative orbit around the sun and how the Earth is in relation to Mars. One is lower energy than the other. Conjunction class is the minimum energy, but it creates the longest duration. So it's about 1,000-day mission. And as you go, that particular, for things to align for you to come back, you end up being on Mars or in the vicinity of Mars for 300 days. Opposition class is a higher energy, requires more energy to do it, but it's around a 700-day mission. Then you spend 30 to 50 days on Mars. And so you kind of have those two extremes. Now, NASA has a reference mission in 2039 that I think is on the order of an 850-day mission. So these concepts of talking about what you're going to do on Mars, I mean, first of all, is just addressing, you're talking, 2 to 3 year missions, and how long are you going to stay? I think generally everyone's kind of leaning towards your first mission should be 30 to 50 days rather than a year. And so you're talking about all of that has to happen. And this is where I think people don't understand space and understand how challenging that is. And this argument, let's go direct to Mars, in my mind, makes no sense at all, because you really have to learn some hard things on the moon, which is a lot closer from a comms, travel, and emergency standpoint.
Not the least of which is how wrecked are you going to be when the ship touches down on the surface? Because if you're on board Starship and it takes you 9 months to get there, well, based on the experiences on the ISS, whoever lands is going to be a physical wreck by the time they're expected to head down the cable crane to, to the Mars surface.
You've got a whole radiation environment thing you got to deal with too. But that's where you see these concepts that how you translate it into engineering reality, where you have some big section kind of spinning, where you truly have at least some level of gravity that you can be in to kind of offset the effects of being in weightlessness for that long, and then getting onto another planet. So that the challenges are huge for Mars. And so that's where at least you got to drive some of that down on the moon, is how I'd characterize it. And I think that's the basic path. And this is where I get back to the model, the true model. If we just stuck with it, we'd probably have permanent presence on the moon right now, which is the consistency and constancy of purpose, and stop the cancellations, the stops and starts, without having an overall laid out plan of how you're going to go through all of these and build upon it for the next, with low Earth orbit, the moon and Mars. When Constellation was canceled, it was when President Obama was there, and I think Charlie Bolden was the NASA administrator, and I was President Pratt Whitney Rocketdyne. And Charlie gave me a call and he said, we're canceling Constellation because we want new and innovative ways to get to space, and we want new propulsion ideas on how to get to space. And I'm like, Charlie, I ain't got nothing. I mean, we know all the propulsive concepts, and even the Project Orion with this nuclear pulse. We've got all the chemical. There's nuclear thermal, nuclear electric, solar electric. All these different kind of propulsion concepts exist, and we haven't come up with a Star Wars propulsion yet, or the Star Trek warp propulsion. So canceling something because you want something new and innovative was a poor choice. I know at the time Obama said we're not going to the moon. We've been there, done that. And they were going to go lasso an asteroid and either bring it back or go try and get some stuff off of it. That was a huge diversion from consistency and constancy of purpose. I've been a big fan of space my whole life. I've been deeply into it my whole life. And going from low Earth orbit to a presence on the moon and getting to Mars has been something many of us in the industry and a lot of us in the industry have aspired to and still aspire to. But right now, we haven't done it in a rational and effective manner. And as a nation, we're not aligned about how to do that.
No, things kind of seem to be a little bit scattered there right now. Just the fact that HLS, like the Artemis program, is so far behind, and people are blaming SLS for some reason, but SLS-2 is going to be ready to go April next year, which is way before Starship's ever going to be ready, if ever. Honestly, our opinion here when we're talking about it is that Starship is probably destined for the dustbin. We don't see it as a lander. We don't see it as useful for LEO because there's only so many launches that you can do. If they're developing the system in-house, which is what they appear to be doing, which means like for their own purpose, the only missions that they're trying to pull off with this are the deployment of Starlink units. They're not trying to put together a human lander.
Yeah, and it's up to them to do whatever they want. What we should be questioning is should taxpayer dollars be contributing to that? Because is it really helping pursue the overall mission and agenda? And I think those are hard questions that need to be asked of NASA. And I think Congress needs to be asking those questions versus the alternatives.
Absolutely. So let's deal with a little bit of fantasy for a while. Let's just assume that Musk is actually going to go to Mars. Let's start off with the basics, because that's where we started with the channel, was when he started making these claims about taking 100 people at a time to go to Mars, we hit the brakes. It's like, okay, Falcon's great, and the re-landings are really cool, but that sounds like complete garbage. So let's start with the 100 people per trip. You're obviously familiar with what NASA has as standards. Is it still, for long-term voyages, if you will, 25 cubic meters per person for minimum habitable volume?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm actually not that familiar with the specific standards for actual spacecraft that humans occupy as much as I'm familiar with just how to get them into space and how to get them where they're going. So, I take it at faith on that. I think the challenge here is, and I just saw, by the way, that, it was in Space News. I think they have offered anyone who gets a perfect bracket March Madness a
Yep.
trip to
I was going to
Mars.
bring that up.
So I think the challenge is once again people do not understand the reality and the challenges and the physics of space travel. And so, we see these movies and we see these activities and we see the amazing things that SpaceX has accomplished. And so everybody says, well, nobody thought they could do that. So by natural extension, nobody thinks these things can be accomplished, and they will be accomplished because they say they're going to accomplish them. It's just the leap between what SpaceX has accomplished to date, which is incredible, to going to Mars is far, far, far greater than the average person can possibly comprehend.
Yeah.
And so, regardless of what's being said, the true physics of the timing of getting to Mars, how long you got to stay there with one person even is we're not on a path to be there anytime soon, and certainly not in the next couple of decades, in my opinion.
When we're having debates on Twitter, people bring up Falcon 9, of course, like you mentioned, and use that as the natural extension that, of course, they're going to be able to pull this off with Starship. We don't let them have that argument. We don't let them use Falcon to justify Starship because it's different materials, it's different fuels, it's different engines, it's literally 70s rocket tech. Most of what Falcon uses is not that much different than what was being developed in the 70s.
I'm just a big fan of SpaceX, and they're building their heavy lift rocket, which is going to be capable of 50 tons to orbit at what he's planning is a tenth of the cost of the space shuttle.
We went to the factory, SpaceX factory, and looked at the engine. I got to say, I'm a mechanical engineer. These things are very clean, and the reason is that you don't have to have tubes running everywhere to transmit pressures from one part of the engine to another. It's very nice. And we talked to Jeff Rakicki, who's the head engineer, I guess, of structures there. And he said, we didn't reinvent this thing. We took the NASA documents and manuals and just read them.
Yeah.
So to your point, all the patents and intellectual achievements were done 40 years ago, and these guys are re-embracing it. So it's good.
Is splash landings for human occupants, which is a step backwards from Shuttle. Why didn't they just reinvent Shuttle? Why didn't we use the new materials, the new fuels, new technology, the smaller technology to go back and get us our workhorse? Because that's what Shuttle was. That was your Swiss Army knife. We don't have a Swiss Army knife right now in space.
Yeah, and I think right now there's just a general push or love of what's called a commercial approach, and this idea that we've been there, done that, and therefore we need to do something different. The past was monolithic, nation-led with this kind of technology, and we don't want to do any of that anymore. We don't want to be monolithic. We don't want to be nation-led. We don't want to use that old technology because we've been there and done all that. The future is innovation and entrepreneurship and creativity and wild ideas. And I think that's all really exciting. And I think once again, people relate it back to the airline industry where, it was kind of heavily regulated at one point in time, heavy government development to, there's this huge demand and boats are going away and everybody's flying things on ships. And everybody think that's the natural evolution of where we are in space. And it's just not the reality of the situation, but people don't recognize it. It's fine for everyone to think that. It's fine for private companies to invest a lot of money in that. And the question is what's the best use of our taxpayer dollars for the agenda we have? And the other thing is with taxpayer dollars is it's more than just this innovative creativity, commercial and competition and all of that. It's also about, first of all, having systems and processes in place to make sure that taxpayer dollars are going to things that are of value to the nation, first and foremost. And there's checks and balances that are supposed to be in place for some of that. But there's also other things that the nation does that I talked about. There's national posture, leading the globe into space that necessarily, is not the purview of private industry. There's a lot of science that isn't necessarily the purview of private industry. And the inspiration, private industry and NASA can do that. But also as they're spending money, they have requirements like spending money on small businesses, spending money on veteran-owned businesses. There's a lot of societal benefits where the taxpayer dollars get fed back into society for societal benefits that private companies aren't necessarily going to pursue unless they're getting taxpayer dollars and they're being required to do that, which I think is beneficial to society. So there's a whole host of reasons, why NASA should be taking the lead and being a good steward of taxpayer dollars for the long run and not just sort of have NASA be a funnel for money to a bunch of private companies is how I'd characterize it.
I think that's right. Okay, so mystery human spaceflight. Let's say we're on our way to Mars. It's going to take us a year to get there, just to keep the numbers. How much food per person are you packing into that ship, and how much water?
I mean, that's where you have a limitation really on the number of people you can take, right? On the one thing. One interesting concept is that the water could potentially be stored outside the spacecraft and create an additional sort of radiation barrier, that sort of thing. But all these concepts, there are studies going on, there's trades going on. I don't think NASA's even decided on the best propulsive concept to get to Mars and back yet. And there's internal struggles between all of that. Once again, it gets back to architecture and technologies. And I think as you look at this long term, and I keep repeating myself, consistency and constancy of purpose. And as you lay out the architectures and as you look at the architectural trades, then you can outline what technologies are needed that don't exist today, that are essential to getting to Mars, to solve those Mars problems. And of those technologies, which one are also needed for the moon? And you can say, okay, these technologies benefit not only the moon and Mars, so let's focus a lot on those. and work that towards the permanent lunar habitat. But there are other things that need to be developed that aren't necessarily relevant to the moon that still need to be developed to get to Mars. And you got to lay all this out into a pretty detailed technology development plan. And when I was in private industry, as we decided how to invest our R&D dollars, we always had an integrated technology management plan. And the integrated technology management plan used sort of the markets we were going after and what we thought it was going to take to compete and win in those markets as they evolved into the future. And as we saw that, then we talk about what we thought were the most competitive, discriminating technologies that we should invest in and what the TRL level is, and then how to prioritize that. And so my big question to the team was always, how big is this market? How real is this market? And how soon is this market? And based on that, and how hard is the technology to go address the market? And out of that, we'd kind of figure out how to allocate our dollars. And I remember when I was at Pratt Whitney Rocketdyne, I put a lot of money into air breathing hypersonics. And everybody would always tease me, and Pratt would give me a really hard time about the money I was putting into that. And the saying was, hypersonics is the technology of the future and always will be. And but I knew that speed and distance was going to count someday. And that day has come, and so as NASA looks at going to Mars, there are things that are going to count someday. If they go to moon, things that are going to count someday. And regardless of what private industry wants to do, NASA needs to focus its efforts on those things that allow it to best pursue its mission, as opposed to following what best pursues individual company missions.
I do have a question about SLS, Orion, and it comes down to if it looks like Starship is not going to make it, if that technology is just never going to get there, they're never going to land this skinny, oversized cigar tube on its skinny end in 15 feet of dust. How tricky would it be, going back to SP-287, to put a second stage on the Orion capsule and then use that as a lander? You'd have to strap another booster onto SLS to get the extra mass to orbit, but would that even be possible?
I mean, if you're talking about a two-stage where
Yeah,
Orion's like
a
a second
two-stage.
stage, yeah, I don't think Orion has, for its mass, I can't speak for sure, the propulsive capability to be an ascent stage off the moon. I think that would require a significant change to its, I guess it's the service module back there. I'm not quite sure what they call it on Orion anymore, but it is storable, which is nice, but I think Orion would be underpowered for that.
So we'd have
As
to
I said,
add lift engines plus the descent engines. So we're actually adding like two stages.
yeah, architecturally, I think that'd be challenging. I think it'd probably be easier just is to go back to a descent and ascent stage. I mean, in my mind, if I were a king for a day, what I'd probably do to have the most credible way to get to the moon the fastest is work to convert a single stage hydrogen lander to a two-stage lander where the landing stage was hydrogen and the ascent stage was hyperbolic, storable. And I think you could do that probably way faster than you could do this sort of conversion of Orion with the lander concept. And I think that way, Blue Origin's working with I think it's the BE-7 that's going to be the 10,000 pound thrust, deep throttleable engine, which should suit the purpose for a lander, and then look at a storable ascent stage. And I think personally, my opinion is that'd be the fastest way to have a viable lander system of reliable and safe, because the big concern is landing with hydrogen is in the NRHO environment, you're on the moon. If you're on the South Pole, you're on the moon for about 7 days. And so that means you got to keep your hydrogen cold for that many days and be able to light a hydrogen engine on the surface of the moon after that many days, after it's landed in sort of this dusty environment. Even in a perfect world, even having perfect hydrogen propellant conditioning and having no issues with landing on a soft surface, igniting a hydrogen engine in space is not as easy as you think,
Yeah.
especially after that period of time. I would say Aerojet Rocketdyne, is part of L3Harris today now, has, I think, by far the most in-space hydrogen experience in the world, having flown hundreds of hydrogen engines in space after long coasts, many restarts, and over the years have learned many, many, many hard lessons. And you don't have the luxury of learning those lessons when people are on the moon.
All right, we're down to 4 minutes here. I could talk to you all day, but I won't do that to you. I'll save some questions for another time. Just in closing, could you wrap up with what the concerns are for the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration as of today, and how you think they're going to resolve, or what steps are being taken to resolve them?
I was a member of the CDSE as part of Aerojet Rocketdyne, but I'm not an individual member since I have left that business. But I think it does get back to as an individual, and I think my individual perspectives and I would say desires are aligned with CDSE in that deep space exploration, I think, is a priority for this nation. I gave the reasons why in terms of national posture, inspiration, and scientific learning. And I think we want to be a leader in the world on that. We have been in the past, and I think there's real competition for that right now with China. And I think what we need to do is focus on the mission and the architecture and what we need to do to consistently follow this extension from LEO to permanent presence on Moon and learning from that to go to Mars. And I don't think there's one size fits all for answer for that. I think it's a mix of NASA leading the world and leading this nation with activities that NASA owns and operates and builds infrastructure. And I think there's a mix of commercial innovation and private investment that can fit it. But I think at the end of the day, it's not a or, it's an and. It's a collection of all of these. And it's up to NASA as the leader of space exploration for this nation to figure out what that right mix is. It's not up to Congress to dictate it to them. Their job is to say what is really the right mix to achieve the mission. And the mission is not to enable commercial companies and innovation. The mission is Moon and Mars. And I think as we look through it through that lens, it'll be more clear as we do trades what the right approach is for today and in the next few decades, and what the aspirational approach is in the future, maybe 50 years from now. But taking that vision for 50 years from now and trying to apply it today, I think we could say is not working.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Well, thank you very much for your time there this morning. It's been an honor talking with you. Like I said in the original introduction between the two of us, we're just a YouTube channel. We're trying to work out the questions. We're not PhDs. We're not rocket scientists. We're the guys in the corner of the bar with a plate of nachos and a pitcher of beer. Just basically back of the envelope calculations, trying to figure out what's what when we hear certain things. So being able to talk with an actual expert in the field, this has been amazing. And hopefully we can do it again.
Yeah, you're doing, I got to tell you, you're doing some really cool stuff. As I said, I've watched some of your stuff. I'm going to watch a lot more. And I think you're raising some very hard questions that not many people are willing to raise. And you're bringing forward facts. And I think facts and data are really important as opposed to emotional arguments. So keep it up, and I'm happy to chat again anytime.
That is going to wrap up this conversation with Jim Mazur, and we are looking forward to having more in the future. Let's summarize it with what we see as the top 12 takeaways from this interview. And if you would like to add yours to the comments section, that's what it's for. Starting off with consistency and constancy of purpose. From the 3-minute mark of part 1, Jim laid out that core tenet for focused space exploration. Consecutive administrations affecting NASA with conflicting goals and program cancellations are deterring NASA from making progress on that path. Number 2, deep space exploration needs to be led by NASA, using commercial development of technologies only after those technologies have been proven out and matured. Jim calls it an and solution, not an or solution, because commercial providers will not be making NASA irrelevant. Number 3, if NASA is funding the commercial development of a technology, the IP generated should belong to NASA. If commercial companies want to retain the IP and keep it proprietary, they should be developing it on their own dime. But what's happening now is proprietary development is resulting in proprietary mistakes. Number 4, until the viability and reliability of commercial ventures can be proven in LEO, they should not be extended to the Moon, never mind Mars. The Moon is a necessary proving ground for an entire host of technologies, before the jump to Mars is even contemplated. Number 5, the current HLS landers from both Blue Moon and SpaceX are trying to reinvent the wheel to varying degrees. And if NASA actually wants to beat China to the Moon, NASA has existing technology that could enable a human landing using Apollo-era vehicles, while the two commercial providers work out the kinks in their systems. Also, between the two landers, Blue Moon appears to be the one building upon previous knowledge, possibly making their challenges solvable faster. Number 6, the time and money being spent on systems to get to the Moon would be better spent developing technologies that allow humans to stay on the Moon for longer periods of time. Number 7, selecting a penultimate HLS system based on the ability to someday possibly create fuel on the Moon from lunar water or any other resource is a bad choice. The better approach is to build upon what came before you. Number 8, projects under development that hinge entirely on a new technology being created are rarely, if ever, delivered on time and on cost. Number 9, cryogenic temperature management while a lander is on the Moon for an extended period of time is also an unknown variable, while hypergolic, storable propellants are already a known and proven technology. Further, the use of storables would favor a two-stage lander rather than a single stage. Number 10, just because you think physics work on paper does not mean you can translate that into engineering and architectural reality. Number 11, a past success does not guarantee success in every future endeavor. And number 12, if you actually want to learn about any topic, talk to an actual expert every opportunity you get. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic, the first in what we hope will be a growing library of conversations with aerospace experts, particularly regarding Artemis and deep space exploration. If you would like to support future Common Sense Skeptic productions, please visit the links in the video description for Buy Me a Coffee, GoFundMe, and Patreon. Also, we'll appreciate you leaving your comments, giving the episode a thumbs up, and sharing it along your social media networks. Finally, ring that notification bell so that you'll know when the Common Sense Skeptic returns.